You think people today believe weird stuff on the internet? Wait until you hear about the 1950s housewives who smoked cigarettes during pregnancy because doctors literally told them it would calm the baby down. Or the parents who bought their kids radioactive uranium chemistry sets so they could play with real plutonium on the living room carpet. Welcome to the 111 dumbest things Americans believed in the 1950s. A decade so confidently wrong about everything that it makes modern conspiracy theorists look like Nobel Prize winners. And let us dive into the madness. 1. Imagine being a pregnant woman in 1952 and your obstetrician hands you a carton of Lucky Strikes. This was not a joke or a prank. Doctors genuinely believed that smoking during pregnancy would help mothers stay slim and keep the baby small enough for an easy delivery. Magazine ads featured glowing pregnant women puffing away, while the caption claimed their doctor recommended it. Nobody had any clue that nicotine crossed the placenta and starved the baby of oxygen. Women were told that a cigarette after dinner was practically a prenatal vitamin. The result was an entire generation of underweight babies born with breathing problems. It was the worst medical advice ever printed on glossy paper. 2. The A.C. Gilbert Company decided that what every American boy really needed for Christmas in 1950 was his very own nuclear reactor. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab came packaged in a neat metal box and retailed for $49.50. Inside were 4 actual jars of uranium ore that emitted real radiation into your child's bedroom. The kit included a Geiger counter, a cloud chamber, and a spinthariscope to watch radioactive decay with your own eyes. Parents thought this was educational and futuristic. It was absolutely terrifying in hindsight. The set was pulled from shelves after just 1 year, but not because of safety concerns. It was simply too expensive and too complicated for most kids to understand. 3. Polio was the most terrifying disease of the early 1950s, and parents were desperate for answers. Somehow, a rumor spread that ice cream was causing the epidemic. This was not a fringe belief on the edges of society. Major newspapers printed articles warning parents to stop giving their children frozen treats during summer outbreaks. The logic was that polio cases spiked in warm weather, which was also when kids ate the most ice cream. They completely ignored the actual cause, which was a virus spread through contaminated water. Millions of children were denied their favorite summer dessert based on a correlation that had absolutely nothing to do with the disease. It was nutritional panic at its absolute worst. 4. Nothing screams 1950s like the idea of solving traffic jams with small nuclear explosions. A company called Ford proposed a concept car in 1958 called the Nucleon. It was supposed to run on a miniature atomic reactor installed in the trunk. The plan was for drivers to pull into special recharge stations every 5,000 miles to swap out the uranium core. They never actually built a working prototype because the engineers realized the shielding alone would weigh about 80 tons. But Ford genuinely displayed the concept at auto shows and in magazine spreads. Families were told this was the future of driving. Thankfully, nobody ever got the chance to rear-end a nuclear-powered station wagon in rush-hour traffic. 5. Mothers in the 1950s were given a pill called thalidomide to treat morning sickness, and doctors swore it was completely safe. They handed it out like candy to pregnant women across the country. The drug company claimed it had been tested thoroughly and had no side effects whatsoever. This turned out to be a catastrophic lie of epic proportions. The medication caused thousands of babies to be born with severe limb deformities. It was one of the worst medical disasters in modern history. The United States actually escaped the worst of it thanks to one brave FDA reviewer named Frances Kelsey, who refused to approve it. She saved an entire generation of American children from a fate that devastated families across Europe. 6. Everyone in the 1950s believed that the Soviets were hiding under their beds, in their closets, and possibly inside their refrigerators. The paranoia reached such an absurd level that Americans began building backyard bomb shelters and stocking them with canned beans. Senator Joseph McCarthy waved around lists of supposed communists working in the State Department. The problem was that he never actually had any real names or evidence. He just made up numbers that changed every time he spoke to the press. Careers were destroyed, and lives were ruined based on pure speculation and gossip. People lost their jobs for attending the wrong dinner party a decade earlier. It was a witch hunt, with microphones and television cameras instead of torches. 7. Doctors in the 1950s had a brilliant solution for hyperactive children, and that solution was lobotomies. A procedure called the transorbital lobotomy was performed on thousands of patients across America. The technique involved inserting an ice pick through the eye socket and scrambling the frontal lobe of the brain. The inventor, Dr. Walter Freeman, traveled the country performing the surgery in his personal van. He nicknamed it the lobotomobile. He performed over 3,400 operations, many on housewives whose husbands thought they were being too moody. The results were catastrophic. Patients were turned into vegetables or suffered permanent personality changes. He was finally banned from practicing after a patient died on his table in 1967. 8. Real estate agents in the 1950s had a fun trick they called redlining, and they pretended it was just good business. They literally drew red lines on maps around entire neighborhoods and refused to sell homes to certain families. Banks would not give mortgages to anyone who wanted to buy inside those lines unless they matched a specific profile. It was segregation dressed up as a financial policy. Millions of families were denied the chance to build wealth through home ownership. The practice was technically legal and openly practiced for decades. Entire communities were trapped in poverty because a line on a piece of paper decided who was allowed to move up in the world. It was one of the worst economic injustices of the century. 9. Mothers across America were told that formula was scientifically superior to breast milk. Doctors, advertisers, and hospitals all pushed this message hard throughout the decade. Breastfeeding was portrayed as old-fashioned and primitive, something only poor rural women did. Modern, sophisticated mothers used powdered formula from a can. The problem was that formula at the time was basically evaporated milk mixed with corn syrup. It was nutritionally inferior in every measurable way. Babies were denied antibodies, proper bonding, and the perfect nutrition that nature had designed for them. Entire generations grew up weaker and sicker because marketing departments convinced their moms that science was better than biology. The truth eventually came out, but not before millions of kids missed out. 10. The Civil Defense released a cartoon in 1951 called Duck and Cover that starred an animated turtle named Bert. The film taught millions of school children that the proper response to a nuclear attack was to hide under their wooden desks. Teachers held regular drills where students practiced curling into balls on the classroom floor. The message was that a thin sheet of particle board would somehow protect a child from a thermonuclear explosion. In reality, anyone close enough to see the blast would be vaporized instantly, whether they were under a desk or not. The whole program was designed to make people feel like they had some control. It was comforting nonsense dressed up as safety education for an entire generation. 11. Cigarette companies paid doctors to appear in advertisements recommending their brands. The ads featured men in white coats, holding up packs of Camels or Chesterfields with huge smiles. The tagline claimed, "More doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette." It was technically true because the tobacco company handed out free cartons to physicians at medical conferences. The doctors were not endorsing the health benefits. They were just happily accepting free smokes. But the American public had no idea about this little detail. They genuinely believed that cigarettes were doctor-approved and possibly good for your throat. Marketing was still the Wild West with zero regulations on truth. The industry made billions poisoning people with a medical professional's smiling face. 12. Television was brand new in the 1950s, and doctors genuinely warned that watching it too long would cause your eyes to fall out. Magazines published terrifying articles about the dangers of radiation emitted by cathode ray tubes. Parents were told to keep their children at least 10 feet away from the screen to prevent blindness. Some schools even banned homework assignments involving television shows because teachers thought it would damage the students' brains. The actual radiation from those early TVs was minimal and harmless. But the moral panic lasted for years. Entire families would squeeze onto couches placed across the room while squinting at tiny black and white screens. They thought they were being responsible parents, protecting their kids from electronic death rays. 13. The 1954 Salk polio vaccine was a miracle, but the rollout was an absolute disaster. One pharmaceutical company, named Cutter Laboratories, failed to properly kill the virus in their batch. They shipped out vaccines containing live polio to thousands of children across the country. The result was horrific. 40,000 kids contracted the disease from the very shot meant to prevent it. 200 children were left paralyzed, and 10 actually died. The incident became known as the Cutter incident, and it nearly destroyed public trust in vaccines for decades. The government had failed to inspect the manufacturing process properly. It was a tragic reminder that good intentions mean nothing without rigorous quality control in medicine. 14. The Department of Agriculture spent millions of dollars telling Americans that margarine was healthier than butter. They said butter was full of dangerous animal fats that would clog your arteries. The healthy alternative was hydrogenated vegetable oil turned into a yellow spread. Housewives switched over in droves, thinking they were protecting their families. It turned out that margarine was packed with trans fats, which are actually much worse for you than regular butter. The artificial replacement caused heart disease at rates far higher than the natural product it replaced. The entire country spent decades spreading poisonous chemicals on their toast while thinking they were being health conscious. Science eventually figured out the truth, but the damage was already done. 15. A popular diet craze in the 1950s involved swallowing tapeworms to lose weight. Mail-order companies sold pills that supposedly contained tapeworm eggs. Women would take the pills and let the worms grow inside their intestines, eating all their food. The idea was that you could eat whatever you wanted, and the worm would handle the calories. The reality was much grosser. Tapeworms cause severe malnutrition, stomach pain, and dangerous vitamin deficiencies. Some women ended up with worms that were several feet long living inside them. Doctors had to surgically remove the parasites in many cases. It remains one of the most disgusting weight loss schemes ever sold to the American public with a straight face. 16. Every American family was told to build a fallout shelter in their backyard to survive nuclear war. The government distributed pamphlets with detailed instructions on how to stock them. Families spent thousands of dollars digging concrete bunkers and filling them with canned food. The shelters were supposed to protect them from radiation for 2 weeks until the fallout cleared. The actual science showed this was pure fantasy. A direct nuclear strike on any major city would kill everyone within miles, regardless of their shelter. The fallout would contaminate water supplies for months, but families bought the dream because it gave them something to do with their fear. Suburban backyards became filled with concrete tombs that nobody would ever actually use. 17. Coca-Cola was marketed as a health drink throughout the 1950s. Advertisements showed doctors and nurses recommending it for energy and digestion. One popular ad showed a mother feeding Coke to her baby in a bottle, claiming it would help the child sleep better. Nobody mentioned that the drink was loaded with sugar and caffeine, which are the absolute worst things to give an infant. Pediatricians actually endorsed giving soda to children to encourage hydration. Schools even sold it in their cafeterias as a healthier alternative to milk. The idea that a carbonated sugar bomb was nutritious seems insane today, but in the 1950s, Coca-Cola was practically considered a vitamin. 18. Hollywood convinced millions of Americans that a housewife who did not cook with Jell-O was a failure at marriage. Jell-O molds became the centerpiece of every dinner party in suburban America. Recipes were published for truly horrifying creations involving tuna suspended in lime gelatin. Celery and carrots were trapped in yellow, wobbly towers shaped like castles. One popular recipe featured hard-boiled eggs floating in tomato aspic. Women spent hours crafting these technicolor monstrosities to impress their neighbors. It was considered the height of culinary sophistication. Anyone who just served a simple roast and vegetables was looked down upon. The decade may be the darkest moment in American food history. 19. Sex education in the 1950s consisted mostly of terrifying propaganda films. Schools showed students movies warning that a single kiss could lead to pregnancy or a horrifying disease. Young women were told that boys would lose all respect for them if they held their hands before marriage. The films portrayed dating as a minefield of eternal damnation. There was no actual biological information provided whatsoever. Teens learned nothing about how reproduction actually worked. They just learned to be terrified of their own bodies. The result was a generation of adults who had no idea what they were doing on their wedding nights. It was the absolute worst way to prepare young people for life. 20. The United States government conducted over 100 above-ground nuclear tests during the 1950s. They told citizens living downwind that the radiation was completely safe.
Families in Nevada and Utah were encouraged to watch the mushroom clouds as a form of entertainment. Tourists drove into the desert with picnic baskets to witness the explosions from a few miles away. Nobody was warned about the radioactive fallout drifting across their farms and towns. Cancer rates in those downwind communities skyrocketed over the following decades. Thousands of people died from diseases directly linked to the tests. The government spent years denying any connection. It was one of the worst domestic radiation exposures in history. 21. Parents were told that leaving babies outside in cold weather was essential for building strong lungs. Nurseries across America featured porches where infants would sleep in sub-freezing temperatures, wrapped in thin blankets. Popular childcare books recommended at least 2 hours of outdoor exposure every day, regardless of the weather. The theory was that fresh, cold air would toughen up the baby and prevent future illnesses.
In reality, exposing newborns to extreme cold caused hypothermia and respiratory infections. Some babies actually froze to death in their prams while their mothers ran quick errands inside. The practice was considered modern and scientific. It was absolutely medieval when you stop and think about it. 22. Asbestos was called the miracle mineral and was used in literally everything. Homes were built with asbestos insulation in the walls, the ceilings, and wrapped around the pipes. Schools had asbestos tiles on their floors and ceiling panels made of the stuff. Children played with fake snow during Christmas that was actually pure asbestos fibers. Hair dryers blew asbestos straight into women's faces. Even cigarettes had asbestos in their filters, supposedly for extra filtration. Everyone knew it could cause respiratory problems, but the industry suppressed the information for decades. Millions of workers developed mesothelioma and lung cancer from their daily exposure. It was the most widely used poison in American history. 23. The 1950s was the golden age of tranquilizers, and doctors handed them out to housewives like candy. The most popular pill was called Milltown, and it was considered completely harmless. Women suffering from anxiety, depression, or just general frustration with their domestic lives were prescribed massive doses. Pharmacies actually put signs in their windows announcing that Milltown was back in stock. Celebrities threw tranquilizer-themed parties where guests would openly share pills. The drug was highly addictive and caused severe withdrawal symptoms. Thousands of women became dependent without realizing they had a problem. It was mass medication on a scale that would shock modern doctors. The decade basically invented the concept of mother's little helper. 24. Everyone believed that eating spinach would give you superhuman strength because Popeye said so. Parents forced their children to choke down canned spinach based on a cartoon character. The belief came from a chart published in 1870 that listed spinach as containing massive amounts of iron. The decimal point had been misplaced by accident, making the iron content appear 10 times higher than reality. The error was never corrected in American nutritional guides for decades. Entire generations were raised thinking spinach was a miracle food. It is actually a perfectly fine vegetable, but contains about the same iron as any other leafy green. Popeye was selling a lie based on bad math from the previous century. 25. Plastic surgery in the 1950s involved injecting women's faces with paraffin wax. Beauty clinics offered the procedure as a way to fill in wrinkles and plump up cheeks. The wax was heated to a liquid state and then pumped directly under the skin with a large needle. It looked fine for about a month. Then disaster struck. The wax would harden into lumps that shifted around the face, causing horrifying deformities. Women ended up with wax tumors that could not be removed without destroying their features. The procedure was eventually banned, but not before thousands of women were permanently disfigured. It was the absolute worst thing you could pay a doctor to do to your face. 26. X-ray machines in shoe stores were the coolest attraction for children across America. Every major department store had a machine called a fluoroscope that let customers see the bones of their feet through their shoes. Kids would line up to stare at their skeletal toes wiggling inside new loafers. The machines emitted massive doses of unshielded radiation directly into the users. Shoe salesmen operated them hundreds of times a day without any protection. Many of those employees later developed leg cancer and had limbs amputated. Children suffered stunted foot growth and various cancers. The machines were eventually banned in the 1960s, but the damage was already done to an entire generation of shoe shoppers. 27. The government launched Project MK Ultra in 1953 with the goal of creating mind-controlled assassins. The CIA genuinely believed they could program humans like robots using a combination of LSD, hypnosis, and electroshock therapy. They tested the drugs on unsuspecting American citizens without consent. Prisoners, mental patients, and even CIA employees were dosed with massive amounts of hallucinogens. Some subjects jumped out of windows during bad trips. Others suffered permanent psychological damage that destroyed their lives. The program ran for 20 years before being exposed. Most of the files were destroyed by the CIA director to hide the evidence. It was one of the worst violations of civil rights in American history. 28. Doctors prescribed heroin as a cough suppressant to children throughout the early 1950s. Major pharmaceutical companies sold it in bottles labeled as a soothing syrup for little ones. The drug was considered non-addictive and perfectly safe for pediatric use. Parents gave it to their kids whenever they had a cold or kept them awake at night. The medicine was so popular that it was available without a prescription at most drugstores. Children became accidentally addicted before they even understood what addiction was. The government finally cracked down on it by the late 1950s, but for years, American babies were drinking straight heroin to calm their coughs. It was pharmaceutical insanity packaged in pretty glass bottles. 29. Every American household was told that a properly prepared martini could solve any problem. Alcohol was considered essential for social functioning, business meetings, and even parenting. Men drank 3 martinis at lunch and then went back to the office expecting to get work done. Women kept a bottle of sherry in the kitchen for their afternoon pick-me-up. Pregnant women drank throughout their pregnancies, thinking it would relax them. Nobody connected the obvious dots between heavy drinking and terrible decisions. Drunk driving was not even considered a serious crime. The entire country was essentially intoxicated from 9 in the morning until midnight. It is a miracle anyone got anything productive done during the entire decade. 30. The McCarthy hearings convinced millions of Americans that their neighbors were secret Russian spies. Loyalty oaths were required for teachers, government workers, and even lunch ladies. Schools fired teachers who had attended a peace rally in college 20 years earlier. Hollywood blacklisted writers, directors, and actors based on anonymous accusations. Careers were destroyed on the testimony of a single bitter coworker. The paranoia reached such absurd levels that librarians were investigated for stalking books about Russian history. Children were encouraged to report their own parents for suspicious conversations. It was a nationwide witch hunt without any actual witches. The damage to American families and communities lasted for generations after the hearings finally ended. 31. Doctors recommended regular enemas for children as a cure for almost every illness. Constipation, headaches, bad behavior, and even the common cold were all treated with a rubber tube and warm water. Mothers were given detailed instructions on how to administer the procedure at home. Children were subjected to weekly cleansing, whether they needed them or not. The medical theory was that most diseases started in the colon. This was completely wrong, but doctors had been pushing the idea for decades and nobody questioned it. An entire generation of kids grew up with deep trauma from their bathroom experiences. It was one of the most invasive and pointless medical practices ever inflicted on American children. 32. Rock and roll was officially blamed for everything wrong with American youth. Preachers gave sermons warning that Elvis Presley's hip movements would cause teenage pregnancy and communism at the same time. Schools banned the music entirely from their property. Some towns held public record burnings, where parents destroyed their children's vinyl collections. Politicians held hearings investigating whether the genre was a Soviet plot to corrupt America. The panic was completely ridiculous. Rock and roll was just music with a beat you could dance to. But adults of the 1950s genuinely believed it was the end of civilization. Teenagers thought their parents had completely lost their minds. In hindsight, they were absolutely right about that. 33. Lead was added to paint, gasoline, plumbing, and even toys without any hesitation. The industry knew it was toxic, but they kept using it because it worked well. Children chewed on lead-painted cribs and swallowed paint chips that tasted sweet. Gasoline pumps sprayed tiny lead particles into the air of every American city. Water pipes made of lead slowly poisoned families for decades. The effects were devastating. IQ points were stripped from entire generations of children raised in lead-contaminated environments. Violent crime rates later correlated directly with lead exposure levels. The industry fought regulations for years, prioritizing profits over public health. It was one of the worst mass poisonings in modern history. 34. Hollywood movie stars smoked cigarettes in every single scene of every single film. The tobacco industry paid studios massive amounts of money for the placement. Actors signed contracts requiring them to smoke specific brands on camera. Kids watching cartoons at Saturday matinees saw their heroes lighting up between chase scenes.
The message was absolutely clear. Smoking was glamorous and sophisticated. Millions of teenagers started smoking because their favorite movie stars did it on screen. The industry denied using films as advertising for decades, but documents later revealed the truth about the massive payments. An entire generation developed lung cancer, partly because they wanted to look like Humphrey Bogart in their favorite gangster film. 35. DDT was sprayed on American children as a fun summer activity. Trucks drove through suburban neighborhoods, pumping thick clouds of pesticide into the air. Kids would run behind the trucks, playing in the fog like it was magical smoke. The government assured parents that the chemical was completely harmless to humans. It killed mosquitoes, flies, and any other bug in its path with amazing efficiency. Nobody bothered to test what it did to the children breathing it in.
DDT turned out to cause cancer, neurological damage, and massive environmental destruction. Bird populations collapsed as the chemical weakened their eggshells. The pesticide was eventually banned, but not before soaking an entire generation of American kids. 36. Housewives in the 1950s were told that cleanliness was the only measure of their worth as women. Magazine articles calculated exactly how many hours per day should be spent on various chores. The average woman was expected to spend 55 hours a week on domestic tasks alone. Floors needed to be waxed weekly and windows cleaned every 2 days. Bed sheets had to be ironed before being placed on the mattress. Any speck of dust was considered a personal failure and a disgrace to the family. Women who worked outside the home were viewed as neglecting their duties. The entire concept of femininity was reduced to housekeeping. It was exhausting, impossible, and completely dehumanizing to a generation of intelligent women. 37. The Hollywood production code banned married couples from sharing a bed on screen for the entire decade. Every television show featured twin beds with a nightstand between them, regardless of how much the characters loved each other. Lucy and Ricky on I Love Lucy slept in separate beds despite having a baby together on the show. The code also banned the word pregnant from being spoken on television. Lucy had to be called expecting throughout her entire pregnancy storyline. The rules were meant to protect viewers from inappropriate thoughts, but they just made everything look absurd and disconnected from real life. American families watched shows where couples slept 3 feet apart while they themselves shared actual beds at home. 38. Every American kid was convinced that gum chewed and swallowed would stay in your stomach for exactly 7 years. Parents, teachers, and older siblings all repeated this warning with complete confidence. The exact number was never explained. Nobody could point to a single piece of evidence supporting the claim. It was just folk wisdom that everybody knew. In reality, gum passes through the digestive system in a day or two, just like any other food. But generations of children lived in fear of the gum clock ticking inside them. Some kids had complete panic attacks when they accidentally swallowed a piece. It was the most persistent childhood myth of the entire decade. Nobody ever figured out where it came from. 39. Shock therapy was considered a legitimate treatment for housewives who cried too much. Doctors would strap patients to tables and send electrical currents through their brains without any anesthesia. The procedure often caused broken bones from the violent convulsions. Memory loss was considered a normal side effect rather than a warning sign. Women who complained about boring husbands or domestic frustrations were prescribed the treatment regularly. Actress Frances Farmer was famously subjected to repeated shock sessions at a state hospital. Many patients came out permanently damaged and unable to function. It was used to control women rather than actually heal them. The practice continued throughout the decade before being scaled back after public outcry and legal reforms. 40. Americans genuinely believed that Elvis Presley was causing juvenile delinquency across the country. Television shows refused to film him below the waist because his dancing was considered dangerous. The Ed Sullivan Show only showed him from the chest up during his first appearance. Churches held prayer meetings asking God to stop the spread of his music. Some cities actually banned his records from being sold to minors. The belief was that his hip shaking would somehow corrupt teenagers into lives of crime. Elvis was basically just a country boy who liked to dance, but the older generation saw him as the devil with a guitar. It was one of the biggest cultural panics of the decade. 41. The government encouraged doctors to recommend cocaine for toothaches and nasal congestion. Small amounts of the drug were still available in various over-the-counter remedies throughout the 1950s. Dentists used it as a topical anesthetic right up through the middle of the decade. Patients were given cocaine lozenges to suck on for sore throats. Nobody considered the addiction potential because it had been legal for so long. Coca-Cola had removed the cocaine from their formula decades earlier, but other products still contained it. The medical community slowly phased it out as safer alternatives became available. But for years, getting a prescription for cocaine was as easy as complaining about a stuffy nose to your family doctor. 42. Nuclear power was marketed as an infinite source of free electricity that would eliminate all poverty. Politicians promised that atomic energy would power cars, heat homes, and even cook dinners within just a few years. The phrase, "too cheap to meter," became a common advertising slogan. Families were told to expect a future where electricity bills simply disappeared from their monthly expenses. Nobody mentioned the small problem of radioactive waste that remained dangerous for thousands of years. The cleanup costs and safety requirements were never factored into the optimistic projections. Nuclear power eventually became one of the most expensive forms of electricity ever developed. The 1950s dream of free atomic energy was pure marketing fantasy from start to finish. 43. Mothers were told that holding their babies too much would spoil them and create weak adults. Childcare experts like John Watson recommended strict feeding schedules and minimal physical affection. Parents were advised to let infants cry for hours rather than picking them up and cuddling them. The theory was that too much love would prevent children from developing independence. Hugs and kisses were rationed like wartime supplies. Fathers were told to never show emotion toward their sons under any circumstances. The result was a generation of adults with serious attachment issues and difficulty expressing feelings. Modern psychology has completely reversed this advice. Babies need constant physical contact and affection to develop properly. The 1950s got almost every parenting question completely wrong. 44. The Kinsey reports shocked America by revealing that people actually had sex lives. Alfred Kinsey published detailed research showing that Americans engaged in all kinds of activities they publicly claimed to never even think about. The books became instant bestsellers and immediate scandals. Religious groups tried to ban them from libraries. Politicians called for Kinsey to be investigated for obscenity. The research was actually pretty scientific considering the era, but Americans preferred the fantasy that everyone was as repressed as they pretended to be. The books proved that the perfect 1950s family was mostly a myth. People were having affairs, experimenting, and doing all kinds of things behind closed doors. The decade was not nearly as innocent as the television show suggested. 45. Every American bomb shelter came with detailed instructions on how to shoot your neighbors. Civil defense pamphlets openly discuss the ethics of defending your shelter from unprepared families. Homeowners were advised to keep firearms ready to prevent others from entering during a nuclear attack. Church leaders actually debated whether killing neighbors to save your own family was morally acceptable. The assumption was that society would collapse into violent chaos within hours. Families stockpiled weapons alongside their canned goods. Children were taught not to reveal the location of their family shelter to friends. It was a strange time when suburban parents prepared to murder the couple next door. The Cold War turned everyone into potential executioners in their own minds. 46. Women were told that a career would make them less attractive to men and eventually cause infertility. Ladies' magazines ran articles warning that too much thinking would shrink a woman's uterus. Female college graduates were pitied rather than celebrated. The ideal wife was supposed to have just enough education to raise smart children, but not enough to challenge her husband. Women who pursued professional careers were called old maids, regardless of their age. Doctors prescribed marriage as a cure for female ambition. The entire society was structured to funnel women into domestic roles. Those who resisted faced social rejection and career sabotage. It was one of the most oppressive periods for American women, despite all the magazine ads showing smiling housewives. 47. Fast food restaurants emerged in the 1950s and were marketed as the healthiest way to feed a family. McDonald's claimed their burgers were packed with nutrition and would help children grow strong. The grease, preservatives, and massive portions were never mentioned in advertisements. Parents felt like good providers by taking their kids to grab a quick meal. Drive-through windows were celebrated as a modern convenience for busy families. Nobody considered that eating processed food every day might cause health problems. Obesity rates were still relatively low, so the dangers were not immediately visible. The foundation for the modern obesity epidemic was laid during this decade. Fast food was sold as healthy convenience, and Americans happily believed it. 48. Radium was still being sold in consumer products well into the 1950s. Glow-in-the-dark watch dials, clock faces, and various trinkets all contained the radioactive element. Workers who painted the dials would lick their brushes to keep a sharp point. These women later developed bone cancer, lost their teeth, and had their jaws fall apart. The tragedy had been known for years, but products continued to be manufactured. Some beauty creams even contained small amounts of radium. It was marketed as a youthful glow enhancer for skin. Women actually paid money to rub radioactive material directly onto their faces. The practice continued until the government finally stepped in and banned the remaining radium-based products from the market. 49. The Levittown housing developments convinced Americans that suburban life was the ultimate dream. Cookie-cutter houses were built in massive identical rows. Every street looked exactly the same. Every family owned the same appliances and drove the same cars. Individual expression was discouraged in favor of conformity. Homeowners associations were created to enforce strict rules about lawn maintenance and paint colors. You could not paint your front door a different color without permission from the board. The uniform aesthetic was supposed to represent the American dream. In reality, it was suffocating sameness disguised as prosperity. Critics called it the ugliest form of conformity ever packaged as freedom. But millions of families bought in and happily surrendered their individuality for a mortgage. 50. Every parent knew that sitting too close to the television would ruin your eyes permanently. The warning was repeated so often that it became an absolute truth in American households. Children were pushed back to designated viewing distances by their mothers every single night. In reality, sitting close to a television does no lasting damage to your vision whatsoever. It might cause temporary eye strain, but nothing permanent. The myth actually came from early televisions that did emit some radiation, but the newer models were completely safe. Parents kept repeating the warning even after it became scientifically meaningless. It was one of those pieces of folk wisdom that refused to die. Generations of kids grew up thinking their parents knew about secret eye rays. 51. The cookbook of the decade told housewives that a proper salad required at least 1 can of tuna fish, mayonnaise, and a mold. Vegetables were considered optional ingredients in salads. The real base was always some form of gelatin or creamy sauce. Cottage cheese was used as a garnish on almost everything. Recipes called for wrapping bananas in ham and then serving them in hollandaise sauce. Nobody stopped to wonder if these combinations actually tasted good. The assumption was that more ingredients meant fancier cuisine. American kitchens produced some of the strangest food ever served to human beings. Guests would politely eat whatever was placed in front of them. The decade was a culinary experiment gone horribly wrong. 52. Americans believed that communism was so attractive that a single conversation could convert anyone into a Soviet agent. Schools actually taught students how to identify communist sympathizers among their classmates. Teachers were required to report suspicious students to administrators. Children who asked too many questions about economics or politics were flagged as potential threats. Libraries removed books that might expose young minds to dangerous ideas. College professors were fired for mentioning Karl Marx, even in historical contexts. The paranoia suggested that American values were so weak they could be overthrown by a pamphlet. It was an insulting assumption about the strength of democracy, but the fear drove public policy for years. Critical thinking became dangerous in American classrooms. 53. Frozen dinners were sold as the future of American family meals. The TV dinner was invented in 1953 and marketed as a revolution in convenience. Families ate aluminum trays of mystery meat while staring at the television instead of each other. Conversation was replaced by the glow of the screen. The food was processed beyond recognition and packed with preservatives. But housewives embraced it because it eliminated cooking entirely. Children developed attachments to specific compartments, like the mashed potato section or the dessert corner. Nobody realized that destroying family dinner conversation would have long-term social consequences. The frozen dinner quietly redefined American home life forever. It was convenience food that slowly killed a traditional way of eating together. 54. Doctors told pregnant women to drink heavily during labor to reduce the pain. Whiskey was a commonly recommended pain reliever during childbirth throughout the decade.
Women would be given shots of hard liquor to help them relax between contractions. The alcohol crossed the placenta and sedated the newborn baby as well. Many babies were born already intoxicated from their mother's labor drinks. Doctors thought this was a humane way to reduce suffering. Nobody considered the effects on fetal development from repeated alcohol exposure. Fetal alcohol syndrome was not yet understood as a diagnosis. Millions of children were born with undiagnosed alcohol-related developmental problems. The medical practice was eventually replaced with actual anesthesia, but the damage spanned an entire generation. 55. Nuclear radiation was considered beneficial for minor health problems. Spas advertised radon gas baths as a cure for arthritis and joint pain. Patients would sit in underground chambers filled with radioactive gas for hours at a time. Health food stores sold bottled radioactive water as a tonic for energy.
Some resorts featured radioactive mines, where tourists would sleep overnight for wellness benefits. The belief was that small doses of radiation stimulated healing. In reality, any amount of radiation exposure increases cancer risk. Thousands of Americans paid good money to poison themselves in the name of health. The therapies were eventually banned as evidence of the dangers became impossible to ignore. But for years, radiation was marketed as the fountain of youth. 56. Every American boy was told that joining the military would make him a real man. The draft was an accepted part of life throughout the 1950s. Fathers pushed their sons toward military service as the only legitimate path to adulthood. Refusing to serve was considered a moral failure and a personal disgrace. The Korean War ground up young American men by the thousands, with little public debate. Veterans came home with undiagnosed trauma that they were expected to hide. Mental health services for returning soldiers were essentially non-existent. Men who struggled were told to stop complaining and be grateful. The tough guy ideal prevented an entire generation from processing the horrors they had witnessed. It was emotional suppression disguised as patriotism. 57. The average American dinner plate in the 1950s contained enough beef to feed a small village. Portion sizes were absolutely enormous compared to modern standards. A typical steak weighed 12 to 16 ounces and was considered a single serving. Side dishes included mounds of butter, cream, and processed cheese. Salads were optional and usually drowned in thick dressings. Diet advice focused on reducing bread and potatoes rather than cutting meat or fat. Cardiologists had not yet connected saturated fat to heart disease. Americans ate like kings and died young from clogged arteries. The food industry profited enormously from the meat-heavy diet. Nobody questioned whether humans actually needed that much animal protein every single day. 58. Televisions were kept on for entire evenings, whether anyone was watching or not. The glowing screen became the new fireplace of the American home. Families stopped reading books in the evening because the television was more entertaining. Conversation dropped to brief comments during commercial breaks. Children grew up watching 3 to 4 hours of programming every single night. The content was carefully controlled to promote conformist values and consumer products. Americans became the most heavily marketed to population in human history. Advertisers learned to shape desires and create demand for products nobody actually needed. The foundation of modern consumer culture was built in the glow of black and white screens. It changed how Americans thought forever. 59. Segregation was considered completely normal and legally enforced across half the country. Black Americans were denied service at restaurants, barred from hotels, and forced to use separate facilities. Drinking fountains had colored and white labels in many southern states. Schools were deliberately underfunded for Black children compared to white ones. The Supreme Court finally ruled in 1954 that school segregation was unconstitutional. But enforcement was slow and often violently resisted. Governors blocked Black students from entering white schools with state police. It took federal troops to escort children into classrooms. The idea that half the country genuinely believed this was acceptable is hard to comprehend today. But the 1950s were built on that ugly foundation of legal racial discrimination. 60. Every American mother had a secret bottle of amphetamines in her medicine cabinet. Diet pills containing pure speed were prescribed for weight loss without any hesitation. Women could lose 20 pounds in a month while feeling incredibly energetic and awake. The pills were considered completely safe for long-term use. Doctors had no idea they were creating widespread addiction problems. Housewives would take them to clean the house at impossible speeds. Students used them to study for exams. The government actually gave amphetamines to soldiers during the Korean War to keep them fighting longer. Millions of Americans were hooked on legal speed. The consequences only became apparent decades later when the withdrawal crises hit families across the country. 61. The Cold War convinced Americans that their silverware drawer might contain Soviet spying devices. The FBI seriously investigated reports of suspicious kitchen appliances. Neighbors reported each other for owning foreign-made products. A toaster made in Germany was considered grounds for suspicion. Russian dressing had to be renamed because of the unfortunate geographical reference. Some restaurants refused to serve it entirely until anti-communist sentiment cooled down. The paranoia extended into the most ordinary corners of daily life. Anything with a foreign name or origin was viewed with suspicion. The absurdity reached peak levels when some towns debated banning foreign films. It was national paranoia at a dinner table level that affected even the most mundane household items. 62. Polio summer camps taught kids terrified songs about their own paralysis. Children who had contracted the disease were sent to special facilities to learn to live with their disabilities. The camps were run with military discipline and very little emotional support. Kids were forced to sing cheerful songs about their leg braces and iron lungs. The theory was that positive thinking would somehow help them recover faster. In reality, the psychological damage was enormous. Many survivors reported long-term trauma from their treatment at these camps. Nobody considered that children might need actual emotional processing rather than forced cheerfulness. The medical community treated polio patients like broken objects to be fixed. It was one of the worst approaches to pediatric care. 63. Every good American housewife served cocktails to her husband the moment he walked through the door. The ritual was considered essential for marital happiness. Women were advised to be fully dressed and attractive when their husbands arrived home. The cocktail was supposed to ease his transition from stressful work to peaceful domestic life. Magazines printed schedules showing exactly how much alcohol a man needed to decompress properly. Wives who failed to maintain the ritual were blamed for marital problems. Divorce was often attributed to inadequate drink service. The assumption was that men required constant pampering and medication to function in their marriages. It reduced women to personal bartenders with housekeeping duties attached. The dynamic was considered normal and romantic. 64. Children were allowed to roam unsupervised for entire days during the summer months. Parents had no idea where their kids actually went until the streetlights came on at night. The freedom sounds wonderful, but it also meant zero adult awareness of dangers. Kids drowned in rivers, got hit by cars, and suffered injuries without parents knowing for hours. Predators had easy access to unsupervised children in parks and neighborhoods. The free-range childhood was romantic in theory, but often tragic in practice. Missing children were common news stories that rarely had happy endings. The decade had more childhood fatalities from accidents than any time since, but parents considered constant supervision to be smothering and unhealthy. The balance had tilted completely too far in one direction. 65. Household chemicals were mixed without any warnings or safety information. Housewives regularly combined bleach and ammonia while cleaning their bathrooms. The resulting toxic gas sent thousands of women to the hospital every year. Nobody thought to warn consumers about the dangerous combinations. Labels contained product names and nothing else about potential hazards. Children drank colorful cleaning products they mistook for juice. Poison control hotlines did not yet exist to help panicked parents. The chemical industry had zero accountability for consumer safety. Eventually, regulations required warning labels on dangerous products. But for years, the average American kitchen was basically a chemistry lab waiting for an accident. It was a deadly gap in consumer protection that cost many lives. 66. Tanning beds had not been invented yet, but sunbathing was considered essential for health. Women would lay in the sun for 6 hours at a time, wearing tiny bikinis and no sunscreen. The deeper the tan, the healthier you were supposed to be. Pale skin was viewed as a sign of illness or poverty. Children were encouraged to play outside during peak sun hours without any protection. Skin cancer was practically unknown because nobody lived long enough for it to develop before heart disease killed them. The current skin cancer epidemic has direct roots in 1950s sun worship. An entire generation damaged their skin permanently in pursuit of the perfect tan. It was a beauty standard based on ignorance of basic dermatology. 67. Every doctor told patients that ulcers were caused by spicy food and stress. Treatment involved bland diets and complete rest for weeks at a time. Businessmen with demanding jobs were told to drink milk constantly to soothe their stomachs. Surgery was often recommended to remove the damaged portion of the intestine. It turned out that ulcers are actually caused by a bacteria called H. pylori. The treatment is simple antibiotics for about 2 weeks. But in the 1950s, nobody had discovered this cause yet. Thousands of patients suffered unnecessary surgeries for a condition that could have been cured with pills. The medical establishment resisted the bacterial theory when it was first proposed decades later. Scientific dogma can be harder to change than religious beliefs. 68. Teenage girls were told that being popular was more important than being smart. Getting good grades was considered unattractive to boys. Guidance counselors actively discouraged female students from taking challenging subjects like physics or calculus. Home economics was pushed as the only practical education a girl really needed. The advice destroyed countless potential careers in science and engineering. Brilliant young women were funneled into teaching and nursing, regardless of their actual interests.
Society wasted enormous amounts of human potential based on outdated gender stereotypes. Those women who did pursue demanding careers faced constant obstacles and dismissal. The 1950s represents one of the greatest squanderings of female talent in modern history. The opportunity cost for the country was absolutely massive. 69. The advertising industry convinced men that their manhood depended on the size of their car. Vehicles grew to absurd proportions, with massive tail fins and chrome bumpers. The Cadillac became the ultimate symbol of American success. Men went into debt purchasing cars they could not actually afford. Gas was cheap enough that fuel economy did not matter. Cars got 8 miles per gallon and nobody cared. The assumption was that bigger was always better, in every possible way. City streets were redesigned to accommodate the enormous vehicles. Parking became a nightmare for the massive land yachts.
The oil crisis of the 1970s eventually destroyed this entire way of thinking. But for a decade, Americans drove the biggest, least efficient cars ever built. 70. Young couples were expected to marry as teenagers and have children immediately. The average age of first marriage dropped to 20 for women and 22 for men. High school sweethearts were pressured into weddings before they understood who they were as individuals. Divorce was considered a terrible moral failure rather than a possible outcome. Couples who were clearly mismatched stayed together for decades out of social obligation. The result was widespread unhappiness hidden behind suburban facades. Alcoholism, infidelity, and domestic abuse plagued marriages that should have ended, but nobody talked about it publicly. The divorce rate eventually skyrocketed in the following decades as these unhappy couples finally escaped. The 1950s created a generation of trapped partners pretending to be happy. 71. Milk delivery trucks brought fresh dairy directly to American doorsteps every single morning. The system was considered the pinnacle of modern convenience, but the milk itself was often not pasteurized properly. Thousands of children contracted tuberculosis and other diseases from contaminated dairy products. The regulations for milk safety were weak and inconsistent across different states. Some dairies still used unpasteurized milk, despite clear evidence of the risks. The trust in the friendly milkman hid serious public health problems. Eventually, federal regulations required proper pasteurization everywhere. But for years, glass bottles of bacteria were delivered to families who thought they were getting the healthiest drink available. It was a quaint tradition, with serious hidden dangers that killed many children. 72. Dentists recommended sugar as a healthy alternative to various other foods. Commercials showed smiling children eating candy bars, while a dentist explained how sugar cleaned their teeth. The theory was that sugar helped prevent tooth decay by providing energy to the gums. This was obviously complete nonsense, backed by absolutely no scientific evidence. The sugar industry paid for research that supported their products. Real dental research showing the dangers of sugar was suppressed for decades. Tooth decay rates in American children were catastrophic, but parents kept feeding their kids candy based on professional recommendations. It was one of the most successful industry propaganda campaigns in history. The dental establishment eventually reversed their position, but not before millions of cavities were drilled in American mouths. 73. Gender roles in the 1950s were so rigid that men could not cry under any circumstances.
Boys who showed emotion were beaten by their fathers to toughen them up. The message was absolutely clear. Real men suppressed all feelings except anger. The result was generations of emotionally stunted American males who could not connect with their families. Suicide rates among middle-aged men spiked decades later as the consequences became apparent. The tough guy ideal prevented fathers from showing love to their sons. Entire relationships were poisoned by the demand for constant masculine performance. Therapy was considered weakness, and struggling men were told to just get over it. The damage to American family life lasted for generations after the decade ended. 74. Housewives were sold electric appliances as liberation devices that would free them from work. Washing machines, dishwashers, and vacuum cleaners were marketed as paths to leisure. The reality was that standards of cleanliness simply rose to match the new technology.
Women ended up spending the same number of hours on housework as their mothers had. The machines just allowed them to do more laundry, wash more dishes, and clean more rooms. The promised free time never materialized. Instead, American homes became cleaner than any in history, with women still working full-time to maintain them. It was a technological revolution that failed to deliver its advertised benefits. The burden remained on the same shoulders despite all the gleaming new gadgets. 75. Every American school had a Pledge of Allegiance ritual performed every single morning. The phrase, "under God," was officially added to the pledge in 1954 to distinguish America from godless communists. Students who refused to participate faced suspension or expulsion. Jehovah's Witnesses who had religious objections were beaten by classmates for being unpatriotic. The ritual was considered essential to building national character. Children as young as 5 were required to swear loyalty to the flag without understanding the words. Critical thinking about patriotism was considered dangerous and subversive. The mandatory nature of the ceremony contradicted the actual values of democracy, but nobody was supposed to notice that irony. It was indoctrination disguised as civic education for impressionable young minds. 76. Pharmacies sold raw benzedrine inhalers over the counter for nasal congestion. The product was basically a paper tube filled with pure amphetamine. Users were supposed to sniff it for cold symptoms, but many would crack them open and eat the contents. The resulting high was intense and addictive. Musicians, truck drivers, and students became hooked on the legal stimulant. Overdoses sent thousands of users to hospitals. The benzedrine inhaler was eventually pulled from the market, but its legacy in American drug culture lasted for decades. It was one of the first mass addictions enabled by loose pharmaceutical regulations. Teenagers could literally walk into any drugstore and buy pure speed with their lunch money. The results were absolutely predictable and destructive. 77. The Red Scare convinced parents that their children's comic books were Soviet propaganda. A psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham wrote a book claiming that Batman was turning boys gay and Wonder Woman was promoting lesbianism. The Senate held actual hearings to investigate the threat of superhero comics to American youth. Public comic book burnings were organized in small towns across the country. Parents threw their children's collections into bonfires to prevent corruption. The industry was forced to adopt a strict code that censored most interesting content. Horror comics were essentially banned entirely from mainstream distribution. The moral panic destroyed dozens of comic book companies and cost thousands of jobs. It was a complete overreaction to harmless children's entertainment that adults failed to understand. 78. Every American home came equipped with a fake bomb shelter sign in the front yard. Civil defense officials distributed placards that indicated the family was prepared for nuclear attack. The signs were supposed to reassure neighbors and demonstrate patriotic preparation. In reality, most of the shelters were not actually capable of surviving a real nuclear strike. The signs were pure theater with no practical value. Families paid for the signs and the minimal shelter construction out of social pressure. Nobody wanted to be the only house on the block without proper preparation. The Cold War turned suburban yards into theaters of fake security. It was performance art passing as civil defense. Nothing would have saved any of these families from an actual bomb. 79. Doctors performed forced sterilizations on poor women throughout the decade. The procedure was often done without informed consent during other medical treatments. Women would go to the hospital for a routine surgery and wake up unable to have children. The targets were disproportionately poor, immigrant, and non-white patients. Eugenics theories from earlier decades still influenced medical practice. Over 60,000 sterilizations were performed in the United States during the 20th century. Many of them happened in the 1950s. The practice was considered a public health measure to prevent undesirable reproduction. Patients had no legal recourse for decades. It was one of the worst medical abuses in American history and affected mostly the most vulnerable populations. 80. Every American kid believed that stepping on a crack would break their mother's back. The rhyme was taught on playgrounds across the country. Children actually avoided sidewalk cracks with genuine fear. Some developed minor obsessive behaviors around the superstition. Parents rarely explained that it was just a silly rhyme with no actual power. The belief coexisted with other childhood myths, like the boogeyman and the tooth fairy. Kids lived in worlds where their actions had magical consequences for family members. The superstitions were harmless, but revealing of how children processed anxiety about hurting their parents. It was folk wisdom transmitted through generations of playground culture. Modern kids still hear the rhyme today. Some myths refuse to die, regardless of evolving knowledge. 81. Every American family photograph was staged to look identical to every other family photograph. The dad stood tall in back wearing a suit. The mom sat in front smiling with her hands folded in her lap. Children were arranged by height, with polished shoes and neatly combed hair. Nobody ever smiled naturally because the photographer told them when to pose. Spontaneous moments were considered bad photography. The resulting images all looked like the same family with different faces. Family albums were collections of identical frozen moments. No argument, illness, or real emotion was ever documented. It created a false memory of perfect childhood for entire generations. People would later look at the photos and wonder why they could not remember anything real. 82. Travel agents sold Americans on the idea that driving across the country was the ultimate family vacation. The interstate highway system was still being built, so most trips involved terrible two-lane roads. Cars broke down constantly without any roadside assistance. Children became violently carsick in vehicles without air conditioning. Motels varied from acceptable to genuinely dangerous for travelers. The vacations were usually miserable for everyone involved, but the magazines showed happy families smiling in front of national landmarks, so parents kept trying to recreate the fantasy. Millions of unhappy road trips were undertaken in the name of family bonding. The memories were often of arguments, breakdowns, and terrible meals at roadside diners. It was pure marketing disconnected from reality. 83. Fashion magazines told women that their waists needed to be exactly 18 inches to be attractive. Corsets and girdles were used to force bodies into impossible proportions. Dieting reached extreme levels with cigarettes and coffee replacing actual meals. Women regularly fainted in public from lack of food. The ideal was based on Christian Dior's new look, which required reshaping the human body. Organs were literally compressed and displaced by the tight undergarments. Long-term health problems developed in women who maintained the look for years. Broken ribs and digestive issues were common side effects. The fashion industry cared nothing for actual female health. Beauty standards prioritized aesthetics over anatomy.
It was physical torture disguised as elegance for millions of women across America. 84. The average American family had a milk cow's worth of dairy products in their kitchen cabinet. Condensed milk, evaporated milk, powdered milk, and dozens of other dairy products filled the shelves. The assumption was that milk in every form was essential for human nutrition. Ice cream was considered a perfect food for any meal. Butter was spread thick on every piece of bread. Cheese was melted into every possible dish. The dairy industry had convinced Americans that their bodies needed massive amounts of milk products daily. Lactose intolerance was considered a rare problem rather than a common human trait. The dairy-heavy diet contributed to heart disease and obesity rates, but the industry marketing was so effective that questioning milk was almost heretical. 85. Dentistry in the 1950s involved pulling teeth as the first line of treatment for almost every problem.
Root canals existed, but were considered too expensive for average patients. Most dentists simply removed problem teeth rather than trying to save them. By age 40, many Americans had lost half their original teeth. Dentures were considered a normal part of middle age. The assumption was that teeth would eventually fail and be replaced with plastic ones. Preventive dentistry was practically non-existent. Kids only visited dentists when they had major pain or visible decay. Regular cleanings and checkups were considered luxuries. The result was terrible dental health across the entire population. Modern dentistry would be unrecognizable compared to the 1950s approach to oral care. 86. Parents were told that formula feeding was modern and breastfeeding was primitive. The dairy industry heavily promoted this message through pediatricians. Hospitals actively separated newborns from mothers to prevent breastfeeding from starting.
Nurses would bottle feed infants during the first days without asking the mother's preference. By the time mothers were discharged, their milk supply had dried up from lack of stimulation. Women who wanted to breastfeed faced institutional obstacles at every step. The dominant culture treated the practice as backwards and lower class. Brand name formulas were considered scientifically superior to human milk. Entire generations missed out on the immune benefits of breastfeeding. Modern research has completely reversed this position. Breast milk is now recognized as vastly superior. 87. Every father was expected to handle all family finances without input from his wife. Women were not allowed to have their own bank accounts or credit cards. Any money a woman earned legally belonged to her husband. Divorced women often left marriages with absolutely nothing because their names were on nothing. Banks refused loans to single women, regardless of their income.
The entire financial system was built around male control of resources. Widowed women often discovered they had no idea how their household finances worked. They struggled to manage money after their husbands died. The economic dependency was complete and deliberate. Women were essentially kept in the dark about their own family's financial situation. It was economic oppression disguised as traditional family values. 88. The polio vaccine was initially distributed only to white middle-class children. Black communities and poor rural areas received fewer doses despite having higher infection rates. The distribution system reflected the broader racial inequalities of the era. Thousands of children contracted polio who could have been vaccinated if the rollout had been fair. Medical care was still rigidly segregated across most of the country. Hospitals refused to treat Black patients with polio, even as white children received advanced care. Iron lungs were reserved for white victims at many facilities. The vaccine miracle was real, but its benefits were distributed unequally. It would take years before immunization reached the populations that needed it most. Public health was not actually public for everyone. 89. Mothers were told that fresh air was essential for babies, even in freezing weather. Pram walks in winter were considered necessary for proper development. Infants were bundled up and pushed through snowstorms for hours at a time. Some mothers even left babies in strollers outside shops while they ran inside for errands. Child abductions during these unattended periods were not uncommon, but the fresh air obsession overrode normal safety concerns. Scandinavian traditions of outdoor baby napping were imported and taken to extremes. American mothers did not adapt the practice to local weather conditions. Babies developed frostbite on cheeks and fingers from excessive cold exposure. The fresh air myth prioritized ideology over practical childcare in many middle-class households. 90. Schools punished left-handed children by forcing them to write with their right hands. Teachers would tie the left hand behind the back during writing lessons. The belief was that left-handedness was somehow unnatural or even evil. Children who resisted the forced change developed stutters and learning disabilities. The punishment had lasting psychological effects on countless students. Handwriting suffered because the kids were working against their natural abilities. Teachers were trained to believe that left-handedness was a problem to be fixed. It took decades for educational psychology to recognize the practice as harmful. Modern schools celebrate left-handedness as a normal variation, but the 1950s created an entire generation of damaged left-handers forced to pretend they were right-handed. 91. Medical professionals believed that autism was caused by cold mothers who failed to love their children properly. The theory was called the refrigerator mother hypothesis. Parents were blamed for their children's neurological differences. Mothers were sent to therapy to unlock their supposed emotional blocks. The children were removed from families and placed in institutions to heal from maternal neglect. The theory was complete nonsense, with absolutely no scientific basis, but it caused enormous suffering for families dealing with autistic children. Mothers carried unnecessary guilt for years, thinking they had caused their child's condition. The real biological causes would not be understood for decades. It was psychological malpractice on a massive scale that tortured families already struggling with difficult situations. 92. Every American family was expected to attend church every single Sunday, without exception.
Skipping services was considered deeply suspicious and possibly communist. Churches kept attendance records that were sometimes shared with employers. Men could lose their jobs for failing to show up at religious services regularly. The Cold War had fused Christianity with patriotism into a single required identity. Atheists and agnostics kept their beliefs completely hidden from everyone. Jewish families felt pressured to downplay their religious differences. Other faiths were viewed as foreign and potentially subversive. The pressure created a false image of religious unity that masked enormous diversity. Private beliefs often differed wildly from public performances. The decade prioritized conformity over genuine spiritual exploration across the country. Dieting advice in the 1950s. Recommended eating nothing but grapefruit for 2 weeks at a time. The theory was that grapefruit had magical fat-burning enzymes that eliminated pounds.
Women would become severely malnourished and sick following these extreme diets. Some variations allowed only black coffee and hard-boiled eggs as supplements. Doctors actually endorsed the plans as rapid weight loss solutions. The nutritional science was completely absent from the recommendations. Women developed serious health problems from the repeated starvation cycles. The weight would come back immediately once normal eating resumed. Yo-yo dieting damaged metabolisms for life, but the magazine industry kept promoting miracle diets every single month. It was an entire industry built on wishful thinking and dangerous nutritional advice. 94. Barbers in the 1950s offered shaves with a straight razor as a standard service. The blades were not always properly sterilized between customers. Hepatitis and other blood-borne diseases were transmitted through contaminated razors. Men would relax in the chair, unaware they were being exposed to infections. Mustaches and beards were considered unprofessional and unpatriotic. Every businessman was expected to be clean-shaven at all times. The daily shave was a masculine ritual that nobody questioned. Safety razors were becoming common, but the professional shave still had cultural status. Barbershops were important social spaces where men gathered. Nobody considered the health risks of shared blades. Modern hygiene standards would be shocking to 1950s barbers who prided themselves on tradition. 95. Canned food was considered superior to fresh food throughout the decade. The preservation process was viewed as a scientific improvement over nature. Vegetables in cans were marketed as more nutritious than their raw counterparts. Fresh produce was associated with poverty and rural living. Urban sophisticates ate from cans as a status symbol. The sodium and preservative content was not considered a health concern. Home gardens fell out of fashion as a sign of backwardness. Frozen vegetables gradually replaced cans as freezer technology improved. But for most of the decade, the can opener was the most important tool in the American kitchen. It was convenience food elevated to cultural ideal. Fresh eating traditions were actively abandoned in favor of industrial food products. 96. Smoking was allowed in hospitals, including in patient rooms and delivery wards. Nurses would light cigarettes for bedridden patients who could not manage alone. Doctors smoked while performing examinations on unconscious patients. Ashtrays were standard equipment in every hospital room. Secondhand smoke affected recovery rates for surgery patients. Newborn babies came into the world surrounded by cigarette fumes. Expectant mothers smoked during labor, with their doctors participating. The entire healthcare system was saturated with tobacco use. Nobody considered that hospitals should be smoke-free environments. The medical establishment was literally poisoning its own patients with each visit. Modern hospital policies would be unrecognizable to 1950s healthcare workers. The cultural blind spot around tobacco was absolutely massive in every institution. 97. Swimming pools were segregated, with whites-only signs posted prominently at entrances. Black families had to travel long distances to find any pool that would admit them. When integration was attempted, white communities sometimes drained and destroyed pools rather than share them. Cities closed public swimming facilities rather than comply with desegregation orders. The petty cruelty was matched by obvious racism. Children suffered because adults could not share basic recreational resources. The swimming skills gap between racial groups in America actually dates to this era. Access to water activities shaped who learned to swim safely. Drowning statistics reflected these historical injustices for generations.
The simple joy of summer swimming became another battleground in the civil rights struggle. 98. The Kinsey reports were banned from many libraries, despite being legitimate scientific research. Librarians who stocked them faced pressure from community groups and religious leaders. Some were actually fired for refusing to remove the books. The information in the reports was considered too dangerous for ordinary Americans to access. The same communities that banned the research were filled with people engaging in the activities Kinsey described. Hypocrisy was built into the censorship efforts. Reading about sex was considered more dangerous than actually having it. The bans were eventually overturned through court challenges, but for years, scientific information was treated like pornography. Adult Americans could not access research about their own lives without legal risk. It was absolute absurdity. 99. Every good housewife was expected to maintain her figure throughout her entire life. Weight gain after marriage was considered a betrayal of the husband. Women were advised to weigh themselves daily and adjust their eating accordingly. Pregnancy weight had to be lost within weeks of giving birth. Older women were told to dress in specific ways to hide any body changes. The pressure was constant and impossible to maintain healthily. Eating disorders went completely unrecognized as mental health conditions. Women simply suffered privately while starving themselves into acceptable shapes. The standards were created by male fashion designers and magazine editors. They had no relationship to actual human biology or health. Millions of women damaged their bodies trying to achieve impossible ideals for decades. 100. Americans believed that their country was the greatest nation in the history of the world. Any criticism was considered treasonous and un-American.
Children were taught a sanitized version of history, where America had never done anything wrong. Slavery was mentioned briefly as an unfortunate misunderstanding that had been solved completely. Native American genocide was presented as manifest destiny and progress. The civil rights movement was seen as ungrateful protests by people who should be happy with their situation. The gap between the official story and reality was enormous, but questioning the narrative was dangerous for careers and social standing. The national myth was actively enforced through education, media, and social pressure. Critical thinking was considered disloyalty to the country. 101. The space race convinced Americans that reaching the moon was the most important goal in human history. Billions of dollars were spent on rocket development while poverty persisted at home. Children were told that astronauts were the ultimate heroes, regardless of their actual accomplishments. Anti-intellectualism coexisted strangely with massive science spending. The country celebrated engineers and scientists while cutting education budgets. Space achievements were used for Cold War propaganda rather than scientific progress. Soviet successes caused national panics about American educational inadequacy. Sputnik triggered emergency school reforms that happened overnight. The priorities seem strange in hindsight, but the dream of space dominated the cultural imagination throughout the decade. It was technological obsession that had little connection to most people's daily lives. 102. Advice columnists ruled American households with absolute moral authority. Dear Abby and Ann Landers told millions of readers how to live their lives. Their advice reflected the conservative values of the era without question. Women struggling in marriages were told to try harder rather than consider divorce. Victims of abuse were often advised to reconcile with their abusers. Homosexuality was treated as a disease requiring medical treatment. The columnists had no psychological training, but wielded enormous cultural influence. Their opinions were repeated as if they were scientific facts. Families followed their guidance through serious crises. The damage from bad advice columns was substantial, but nobody questioned the wisdom of letting random newspaper writers determine national moral standards. It was mass manipulation through folksy wisdom. 103. Doctors handed out prescriptions for diet pills to teenage girls worried about their weight. Parents would actually request the medications for their daughters. Amphetamines were prescribed to perfectly healthy adolescents based on body image concerns. The resulting addictions affected young women during their most vulnerable developmental years. Some teens became dependent on the pills throughout their entire adult lives. The medical community saw nothing wrong with chemically altering the bodies of growing children. Weight loss was prioritized over psychological and physical development. Eating disorders emerged alongside the prescription patterns. The dangerous combination of drugs and impossible beauty standards created a generation of damaged women. Pediatric amphetamine use was considered routine rather than concerning. The long-term consequences were devastating. 104. Every good American home had a gun collection displayed prominently in the living room. Children were taught to shoot as a rite of passage. Hunting was considered an essential masculine activity, regardless of actual interest. Gun safety education was minimal or non-existent. Accidental shootings of children by siblings were considered unfortunate tragedies rather than preventable accidents. Firearms were stored loaded and unlocked in most homes. The assumption was that kids would figure out gun safety naturally. They often did not. Annual statistics of childhood gun deaths were alarming but largely ignored. The cultural attachment to firearms prevented any meaningful safety conversations. Second Amendment absolutism had not yet developed, but the foundations were being laid. Weapons were simply a normal part of American domestic life. 105. Mental hospitals were built on the outskirts of cities to hide patients from public view. The institutions were often horrifying places with minimal treatment. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and restraint were standard tools. Patients could be committed by family members without any real due process. Women were particularly vulnerable to unwanted institutionalization by husbands. The treatment often made conditions worse rather than better. Rehabilitation was rarely the actual goal. Containment and control were the primary functions. Decades later, the facilities were exposed as essentially prisons with medical pretensions. The movement to close them began in the 1960s, but throughout the 1950s, hundreds of thousands of Americans were trapped inside these institutions. Many never came out alive. The cruelty was matched by the complete ineffectiveness of the treatment. 106. Family dinner conversations were dominated by the father's opinions on every subject. Children were expected to speak only when spoken to. Wives supported their husbands' views publicly, regardless of their private disagreements. Meals were formal events with strict rules about behavior. Elbows on the table could result in punishment. Specific utensils had to be used for specific foods. The atmosphere was often tense and performative. Families acted out roles rather than genuinely connecting. Modern casual family dinners would have seemed scandalous to 1950s parents. The formality was considered essential to good upbringing, but it prevented real conversation and emotional connection. Children grew up feeling unable to share their actual thoughts with their parents. The communication gap lasted into adulthood for many families. 107. American restaurants served every meal with a side of white bread and butter. The assumption was that bread was essential for any civilized eating experience. Pasta, rice, and potatoes were considered foreign and exotic foods. Italian, Chinese, and Mexican restaurants were exotic novelties rather than standard options. International cuisine was still viewed with suspicion in most of the country. The typical American diet was extremely limited by modern standards. Vegetables were usually boiled beyond recognition. Spices beyond salt and pepper were rare in home cooking. Flavor was considered suspicious. Bland food was thought to be more nutritious than anything interesting. The culinary dark ages lasted throughout the decade. Food exploration would eventually transform American eating, but the 1950s represented peak blandness in home cooking history. 108. Children were taught that divorce was a personal failure that destroyed families permanently. Divorced parents faced social ostracism in their communities. Kids from broken homes were considered damaged and destined for problems. The pressure to stay married kept couples in deeply unhappy situations. Domestic violence was often hidden to avoid the shame of divorce. The no-fault divorce laws did not yet exist. Getting out of a marriage required proving specific legal grounds. Women often had to choose between abuse and destitution. The legal system favored preserving marriages over protecting individuals. Mental health was sacrificed for social respectability. Thousands of families suffered in silence behind closed doors. The perfect facade of 1950s marriages hid enormous amounts of genuine human misery and suffering. 109. The Beat Generation was considered a dangerous threat to American values. Writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg were portrayed as communist sympathizers. Their poetry and prose explored themes of alienation, drug use, and nonconformity. The establishment viewed them as enemies of civilization. Bookstores selling beat poetry faced legal harassment. Howl by Ginsberg was the subject of an obscenity trial. The judges had to decide whether poetry could be legally banned. The Beats eventually won the cultural battle as the decade ended, but throughout the 1950s, they were seen as dangerous radicals undermining the country. Their actual message was remarkably tame by modern standards. They just wanted honest conversations about real human experiences. The mainstream found even that level of honesty absolutely threatening. 110. Doctors in the 1950s still believed that many illnesses could be cured by bleeding patients. The practice had declined from its medieval peak, but still existed in some rural areas. Leeches were occasionally used for specific conditions. Cupping therapy was practiced in immigrant communities. The medical establishment had not completely eliminated ancient practices. Patients with high blood pressure were sometimes drained of blood as a treatment. The theory was that removing bad blood would restore balance. Modern medicine had dismissed these ideas decades earlier, but the outdated treatments persisted in various forms throughout the decade. Alternative medicine coexisted with scientific medicine in strange ways. Patients often received both approaches simultaneously. Medical practice was less standardized than the profession claimed. 111. Every single American believed the 1950s were the perfect decade in the history of the world. Nostalgia for the era persists even today, despite all the evidence against it. The image of happy suburban families and station wagons erased the reality of racism, oppression, and widespread suffering. Women trapped in boring marriages were portrayed as fulfilled homemakers. Children damaged by harsh parenting were called well-behaved. The decade branded itself as golden while hiding enormous problems beneath the surface. The myth was so successful that politicians still promise to return to that era. They conveniently forget the lobotomies, segregation, and toxic chemicals. The real 1950s was a strange mix of progress and horror. The mythology has outlasted the reality by decades. It remains the most successfully marketed period in American cultural history. And that is 111 reasons the 1950s was not nearly as golden as your grandparents remember. If you feel smarter now than you did an hour ago, you know what to do. And I have to know which of these was the absolute worst. Was it the radium face cream or the tapeworm diet pills? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, stay smart, and see you in the next disaster.